A clogged drain doesn't need a $200 plumber or a $15 chemical bottle to fix. It can often be cleared with a solution that costs less than $1, made from ingredients already sitting in your kitchen. No tools, no special skills, no waiting for a service appointment. And yet, almost no one uses it anymore. Think about that for a second. Every time your sink slows down or your shower starts backing up, the default reaction is the same. Buy a branded cleaner or call a professional. It feels like the only real option. But that assumption hides something much simpler and much cheaper. Because the most common types of household clogs, grease, soap residue, and hair buildup, don't actually require harsh chemicals or expensive intervention. They respond to a basic chemical reaction that you can trigger yourself in minutes, using items you've likely owned for years, without ever considering their full potential. This is where things get interesting, because the solution isn't new. It isn't a hack discovered on the internet. It's something that existed long before modern plumbing services became mainstream. A straightforward combination that creates a powerful reaction inside your pipes. One that can loosen, break apart, and flush away the very materials causing the blockage. When used correctly, it doesn't just sit on top of the clog like many commercial products. It actively works through it, pushing and dissolving at the same time. And yet, despite how accessible and effective it is, this method has quietly faded from everyday use. You won't find it prominently displayed in hardware stores. You won't see it marketed in ads. And when most people search for solutions, it rarely appears as the primary recommendation. Instead, the focus is always on stronger, more expensive alternatives. Products designed to look more powerful, feel more advanced, and justify a higher price. But here's the uncomfortable part. The ingredients behind many of those commercial solutions aren't fundamentally different in purpose. They're just repackaged, concentrated, and sold back to you at a markup. Meanwhile, the simpler option, the one that costs almost nothing, sits in the background, ignored not because it stopped working, but because it stopped being talked about. And once you realize that, the problem isn't just a clogged drain anymore. It's the fact that a solution this simple could exist in your own home and still feel invisible. And the deeper you look into it, the harder it is to believe this was ever unknown in the first place, because it wasn't. There was a time when this exact method was simply part of everyday life. Long before specialized drain products lined store shelves, households relied on basic, accessible materials to maintain their own plumbing. It wasn't considered a trick or a shortcut. It was normal. Something passed down quietly, from one generation to the next. The same way people learned how to clean, cook, or fix small problems around the house without outside help. In older homes, especially throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, keeping a drain clear wasn't a job you outsourced. It was something you handled yourself. Kitchens and wash areas often had simple routines, small preventive steps repeated regularly to stop buildup before it became a serious issue. And when a clog did happen, the response wasn't panic or a phone call. It was a process people already understood. What's important here is that this knowledge wasn't rare or specialized. It didn't belong to experts. It belonged to everyone. Farmhouses, city apartments, rural communities, regardless of location or income, the same approach appeared again and again. Basic ingredients were kept within reach, not as solutions, but as part of daily life. And because they were so common, no one thought to question whether they worked. The results spoke for themselves. Drains flowed, problems were solved, life moved on. But over time, Something shifted. As industries expanded and services became more accessible, the role of the homeowner began to change. Tasks that were once considered simple and routine slowly became technical or professional. What used to be common knowledge started to feel outdated, then unnecessary, and eventually forgotten. Not because it stopped working, but because it stopped being taught. And that's the critical distinction. When knowledge disappears this way, it doesn't leave behind a clear gap. It gets replaced. New solutions step in, often more complex, more expensive, and more visible. Meanwhile, the original method fades into the background, not disproven, not replaced by something fundamentally better, but simply overshadowed. So by the time you encounter a clogged drain today, you're not just facing a physical problem. You're facing the absence of something that used to be obvious. And once you see how that shift happened, a more uncomfortable question starts to surface. If this knowledge didn't disappear on its own, then what replaced it? And why? Because look at what surrounds you today. Walk into any hardware store, scroll through online marketplaces, or even search for a simple solution to a clogged drain, and you'll be met with the same pattern. Shelves filled with brightly labeled bottles, each promising fast, powerful results. Prices range from a few dollars to much higher, and the messaging is always the same. Stronger chemicals, faster action, professional-grade performance. And if those don't work, the next step is clear: call a plumber. But here's where things start to feel a little off. Why is it that the first solution you're shown is always the one that costs money? Why is the simplest option, the one already in your home, almost never the starting point? And more importantly, when did fixing a basic household issue become something that feels out of reach without buying a product or hiring a service? Think about your own experience for a moment. The last time your sink clogged, what did you do first? Did you try something simple, or did you immediately assume you needed something stronger? When you stood in front of a shelf full of drain cleaners, did you question what was actually inside those bottles, or just trust that more expensive meant more effective? And if you've ever called a plumber for a minor clog, did the problem feel complex or just urgent? These are small questions, but they point to a much bigger pattern. Over time, entire industries have been built around solving problems that used to be handled at home. Not necessarily because those problems became more difficult, but because the way we think about them changed. Convenience replaced familiarity, marketing replaced memory, and gradually the idea of doing it yourself started to feel like a risk instead of a normal part of daily life. Now, to be clear, not every product or service is unnecessary. There are situations where professional tools and expertise are absolutely required. But the line between what needs a professional and what feels like it needs one has become increasingly blurred. And that's where things get interesting. Because once a simple solution is no longer part of common knowledge, it stops competing with anything. It doesn't show up on shelves. It doesn't appear in ads. It doesn't get recommended. And in that silence, more expensive alternatives naturally take its place. Not because they're always better, but because they're the only options you're consistently exposed to. So here's a question worth thinking about, and I'd really like you to answer this honestly. Have you ever paid for something that you later realized you could have solved yourself? Or even more simply, when was the last time you were shown the cheapest solution first? Because sometimes, the most powerful shift isn't learning something new. It's realizing what you were never reminded of in the first place. And this is where everything comes back to something simple. Because once you strip away the noise, the marketing, and the assumptions, what you're left with is a method that's not only accessible, but practical. At its core, the process relies on a basic chemical reaction. When a mild acid meets a base, it releases gas, specifically carbon dioxide. Inside a confined space like a drain pipe, that reaction creates pressure. Not explosive, not dangerous, but enough to agitate and push through soft blockages like grease, soap residue, and hair buildup. At the same time, the bubbling action helps loosen what's stuck to the inner walls of the pipe, making it easier to flush everything away with hot water. That's the mechanism. But what matters more is how you use it. Because this isn't about dumping random ingredients down your drain and hoping for the best. It's about timing and sequence. Start with hot water to soften the buildup. Then introduce the base, followed by the acid, allowing the reaction to occur where the blockage actually sits. Give it time to work, because unlike harsh chemical cleaners that rely on brute force, this method works gradually, breaking things down instead of burning through them. Finish with another flush of hot water to carry everything away. Used correctly, this approach is enough to handle the majority of everyday clogs. Not the extreme cases, like deep obstructions or physical damage, but the kinds of problems most people deal with in kitchens and bathrooms. And when applied regularly, even in small amounts, it can prevent those problems from forming in the first place. So now the comparison becomes very clear. On one side, you have a method that costs almost nothing, uses materials you already trust, and can be repeated safely over time. On the other, you have products that promise speed and power, but come with higher costs, stronger chemicals, and the assumption that you need something more than what you already have. The difference isn't just effectiveness, it's awareness. Because once you understand what's actually happening inside your pipes and how simple the solution can be, you stop reacting out of habit. You start making decisions based on knowledge. And that shift, even though it seems small, can save you time, money, and a lot of unnecessary frustration over the long run. So if this changed the way you see something as ordinary as a clogged drain, take a second to support the channel. Subscribe, share this with someone who's about to spend money they don't need to, and let me know in the comments. What's one problem you've always assumed needed a professional, but might actually have a simpler solution? Because this is just the beginning. In the next part, we're going deeper into the exact ratios that maximize this reaction, the common mistakes that can make it ineffective, and the lesser-known variations that target specific types of buildup even faster. And once you see those, you'll start to realize just how much more has been sitting in plain sight this whole time.